Welcome back. Well, as you know, the Constitution that was signed into law today in 1996 has many promises. But if you look around, we're surrounded by many problems. How many times have you seen our reporters showing you the problems that we have with service delivery? It can be nearly impossible to get justice when someone breaks the law, when a woman is attacked by a man. How is she treated in a police station? These are all important questions, and there are many views about how we got here. Tony Leon is a former leader of the Democratic Alliance, but before that, he was a part of the constitutional negotiations when he was a member of what was then called the Democratic Party. In some ways, he had, well, much more than a front row seat, really, in the constitutional negotiations and into what's happened in our country afterwards. He joins us now. Tony, good afternoon to you. You've actually written about this day in 1996, the Sharpeville Stadium. I remember it as hot as quite dusty. I remember how important it was. It was such a big moment. How do you remember it?
I remember it very well, and you know, as I wrote this morning, Stephen, it was extraordinary. You know, there was this Air Force helicopter deplaning Nelson Mandela, who walked out in a really triumphant affirmation of all the promise and potential of our country, and indeed the embodiment of that in the framework of our Constitution, which he then signed into law. Very symbolically that day, both it was International Human, or still is International Human Rights Day, was at this George Tarby Stadium in Sharpeville, which, if you like, was the fuse, the massacre there that lit the long 36-year struggle that culminated in his presidency, and indeed in the constitutional promises contained in the document. So, you know, even though I was on the other side of the table from Mandela and the ANC, it really was a very unique, unifying moment for everyone who was involved in the political process then, and how we really did metaphorically and actually join hands around the common cause of the Constitution.
That was a time of huge hope. I mean, maybe I was just younger, but I think we were so optimistic. The world was looking to Nelson Mandela. Apartheid had ended. The Cold War was over. Francis Fukuyama was publishing a book called The End of History. And yet that's not what happened. Things took a very different turn. And now, I mean, a very difficult turn, I think.
They did, they have, and that is absolutely correct. Look, I don't want to say misery loves company, but I was thinking about today and about the countries actually led the way for South Africa. You mentioned the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was really that Velvet Revolution across Eastern Europe that helped bring the decision upon de Klerk that he needed to fundamentally change the South African way of doing business, which he did in 1990. And the thing is that a lot of those republics that were freed from the yoke of Soviet communism and tyranny have actually morphed into illiberal democracies. They aren't liberal or democratic. You look at countries like Hungary, Poland even. So I guess if you use that as the yardstick of countries that evolved from a system of authoritarianism to at least a theoretical democracy, South Africa actually hasn't done badly because we still have regard for the Constitution. The fact that this week in Parliament, after 2-3 years of intense political struggle, the ANC didn't muster 2/3 to pass the Section 25 amendment to change the property rights clause, and then respected the verdict, just as, let me be frank and fair, the ANC, or perhaps grudgingly, respected the verdict of the voters on the 1st of November when they were ousted from control across a string of metros and municipalities. So I think actually, although I am in some ways critical, not because of what we've done, but what we haven't done, I think South Africa, by the international yardstick of measurement, has actually perhaps done some achievable things that other countries haven't managed.
Well, I mean, in a way, it's quite hard to find examples of countries that have gone from repression to freedom in one move and stayed there. I mean, people thought that what would happen to us would happen to Russia. I think you and I can agree, Tony, it didn't. It's really gone back in a way, almost a Tsar-like situation. I expect a phone call from the Russian embassy for saying that. You know, 10, 12 years ago...
An angry letter to the newspaper, at least, is what I get from them.
Indeed. We look at the Tunisian-style revolutions of all of those countries and all of the protests we saw in North Africa. Only Tunisia became a sort of form that we would recognize as democratic, and even there the president eventually fired parliament. The other thing that I would say is that certain rights have become, I think, entrenched. I mean, I don't think that... let me put things a different way. If someone said something, if I said something that the government found offensive, or a senior minister or the president found offensive, or even the Chief Justice found offensive. I mean, the most they could do is write a letter to the newspaper. They could do nothing else about it. And that's because everybody respects the right to freedom of speech. They don't like it. We have furious arguments, but everyone respects it. I mean, that's a really good thing in a democracy.
It's an outstanding thing, and perhaps we can or do take it for granted sometimes. Look, I've always been pretty much a constitutional maximalist. I say this is the common cause of South Africa, and we must enjoy all our rights. They're not a gift from the government. You're entitled to demand them, as people do. But I think you're absolutely correct, Stephen. I think the big difference in South Africa, strange enough, is not the Constitution. It's actually what preceded the Constitution, strange enough, in the darkest days of apartheid. And that was, at the height of struggle in this country for democracy and freedom, there were a lot of civil society movements here. The trade unions, for example, played a pivotal role. The newspapers, Kelsey Stewart, who's the doyen of newspaper lawyers at the time, said editing a newspaper in South Africa under apartheid regulations was like walking through a minefield blindfolded. But newspapers did come out. There were critical, contrary voices. There was even in the somewhat you can argue about how relevant was parliamentary opposition at the time, people like Helen Suzman, who could use the parliamentary platform to expose the excesses of the apartheid regime. So there were a whole cluster and combination of entities, organizations, movements that predated our Constitution. The Constitution gave them protection. And if you look at a lot of the other countries that you mentioned, Tunisia is one, Iraq's another one, and a lot of those Eastern European countries, there was, as someone said, there was the elevator that went straight from the presidential palace to the basement, and there were no points in between. We did have a lot of mitigating movements and entities in South Africa that I think have helped us to cement a constitutional democracy here.
If you look at where we are now, we're sometimes in a country that's got these strange sort of divide. I don't mean divide. I sort of want to say duopoly or a parallel nature. Let me explain what I mean. We're a country where, in one day, a constitutional court can rule that a former president of the party that is still in power, almost uniquely, must go to jail. And we all knew at the time, or I certainly felt, that that person would go to jail, and in fact he did. We can argue about what happened afterwards, but his freedom was curtailed. And this is fundamental. The constitutional court order was observed. And then, just days later, 330 people can die. Partly as a consequence of that. It was an action which followed the other action. What I'm talking about is that on the one side, we have this idea where rights are respected, the rule of law is followed, and on the other side, so many people died illegally, lost their lives, because we cannot and we are not really moving forward as a nation in the way that we want to.
Absolutely. Look, this is a very fine document. I still have my battered version of it, perhaps metaphorically appropriate, from 1996. So I think the framework is great, and that's one of the reasons that I was immersed in both helping to draft it in a small way and very enthusiastically voting in favor of the document in May 1996, and then being present at Sharpeville in December, 25 years ago. But the Constitution vests enormous powers, perhaps incorrectly, but it does, in the president and in the officials appointed by the president. They are actually, if you like, the day-to-day superintendents of the state of our democracy and of our constitutional health. And exactly, that looting and plunder which occurred in July, mostly around Durban and also in Gauteng to an extent, was an absolute indictment of the dereliction of duty, of the collapse of the rule of law, of the people appointed to office, such as the National Police Commissioner and his provincial counterpart, who by no stretch of the imagination could be said to be anything except derelict in their duty. And then, this document as well makes very stringent provision for a national prosecuting authority. They haven't prosecuted one person successfully for those riots, for that looting, for that loss of life, that loss of property, which rather suggests that in many ways this constitution of ours is a theoretical aspiration, not, as we say, the lived reality of people. And if there's too much of a distance, Stephen, between what is written here and the daily experience of people, then there's a credibility crisis, not just for the government, but the constitutional settlement itself, in my view.
Tony Leon, thank you very much indeed. Former leader of the DA, but I think I should really say a former leader of the Democratic Party. Tony Leon, I do appreciate the time. Thank you.